What are principal-agent models? Well, principal-agent models basically capture an interesting relationship and the principal-agent problems that emerge from it. So what's this relationship? Well, we have a principal on the one hand who wants someone else to perform a task for them, and an agent who can perform this task well or not so well or whatever. Basically, the principal-agent problems arise from two sort of theoretical problems. One is moral hazard and the other one is adverse selection. So let's look at these in some detail. Let's clarify some of these terms relating to principal-agent models and see another example of moral hazard in action. In general, principal-agent models consist of a principal who wants someone to perform a task for them. Let's say our principal in this next example is the British government. And the British government, as the principal, wants someone to perform a task. And for example, set up a functioning test and trace system for the coronavirus. How do they get that? Well, they have basically a couple choices. They can, of course, try to do it themselves. But the central government itself, as number 10 office, cannot do it. Okay, so they would have to set up a separate sort of bureaucracy or use an existing bureaucracy like the Public Health England or local health public health teams, or set up or use an outside service provider. So they have some options in who actually performs this task. But the central government itself, of course, cannot just do it. And that's at the core of the principal-agent problems. A lot of the literature on principal-agent problems actually focuses on bureaucracy. So this is not something that is special to outsourced sort of service provision, but applies in similar ways to bureaucrats executing tasks for political principles. More generally, why do principals delegate tasks to agents? Well, it's a variety of reasons, but they usually revolve around lacking information for the task at hand, lacking the expertise or the know-how for the task at hand. Sometimes there are cost considerations, so setting up a whole new bureaucracy sounds quite costly compared to, say, giving it to an existing service provider. And there's sometimes also more nefarious reasons, such as sort of avoiding blame for failure and sort of unloading that blame on some outsourced service provider. But in general, let's assume the principal wants to delegate this task to some agents, to perform this task as well as possible. So the government delegates this task. To whom? Well, to an agent. What's an agent? Well, in this example, it's the outsourced service provider, but we can think of bureaucrats as agents as well. Obviously, the agent doesn't do this for free. The agent gets paid some money to perform this task. Now, in the next stage of the game, because it is a game of sorts, isn't it? The agent has a choice. The agent can perform the task, or has to perform the task, of course. But basically, there is a choice whether to expand a lot of effort, to incur a lot of costs, set up a very expensive system that performs well, set up a high quality test and trace system, but that requires hiring qualified staff and sort of in general spending a lot of money. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative, for example, is to spend less money, hire less qualified staff, exert less effort, and sort of set up a crappy version of the test and trace system. What's more profitable from the perspective of the agent? Well, obviously to spend less money and incur less costs and hire less expensive staff, and sort of to only perform the task just about complying with the contract or whatever that has been set up, and sort of provide a crappy test and trace system. Obviously, if the government was able to directly observe this, there wouldn't be a problem. But the government had to delegate the task specifically because of this lack of information and the ability to perform this task themselves. So of course they cannot actually observe the effort that the agent exerts. So this is the core of the problem. This is the information asymmetry. The agent knows how much they have spent and what kind of quality or non-quality people they have hired, what kind of system they have set up. But the government cannot directly observe all of this. This is the hidden action. The effort or spent in this case by the agent is the hidden action here. And this information asymmetry means that the principal cannot be sure whether, for example, observing the crappy outcome is due to sort of low effort, profit-seeking behavior by the agent, or whether it's just sort of due to chance and the difficulty of this task that they have set. This is the core of the problem. So a principal delegates a task to an agent, and that agent engages in some unobservable action that then determines the outcome for both the principal and the agent. And the core of all principal-agent models is basically thinking about how does the principal get the agent to do what they want them to do, to act in the way that they want them to act. And from the perspective of the agent, of course, how do they sort of maximize profit or utility in this scenario? We have just learned about principal-agent models and about the conflict of interest between the principal and the agent in these models. So these models always include a principal who delegates a task to an agent who then performs this task, but their actual sort of activity, efforts, etc. are unobservable to the principal, and they determine the outcome. And the core is always, how does the principal get the agent to do what they want? And not behave in a way that is perhaps in the best interest of the agent, but not in the best interest of the principal. So let's look at a few more examples of this. The first row is our example from just before. The government is the principal, the agent in this case is the bureaucrat or outsourced service provider, and the hidden action is the sort of the costly effort, the quality of service that is being provided. Another example is from the beginning of the lecture, of course. We as taxpayers, in a way, act as principals vis-a-vis the banks and other financial institutions in terms of risk-taking, because we don't want them to take so much risk that we have to bail them out again. But sort of a cursory look at the current situation in financial markets makes you wonder whether we're sort of drifting into such a situation again. The next example is a classic example, rental car insurance. So in this case, the insurance is perhaps in a way the principal who wants us as sort of rental car users, of course, to avoid sort of unnecessary risk taking and sort of take care of the car. But of course, as sort of the person sort of renting the car, we don't really care about the long-term outcomes for this specific car, and maybe don't treat it as if it was our own car. The next sort of standard example of moral hazard, of course, is the employee relationships. So the relationship between the employer, who acts as a principal, who delegates tasks to their employees and wants them to work hard, to exert a lot of effort, to really focus on work all day in the office. But of course, the employee can instead sort of, I don't know, goof off on Facebook or TikTok all day and not spend a lot of effort. Another example is similar to this in a way, is the shareholders. They want the CEO of the company to perform well and to implement good strategy that is a long-term strategy that benefits their their shares, their ownership of the company long-term, rather than sort of engage in sort of short-term behavior that gives the CEO big bonuses but sort of endangers the long-term stability or success of the company. The next one is quite familiar to us. The lecturer or professor wants the students to learn the material, of course. So I, as the principal, want you guys as the agents in a way to perform this task, to learn all the material, cover all the material, understand the topics well. But of course, I cannot observe the learning directly. But we can talk in the seminars, and we can do formative assessment or summative assessments such as exams to test whether you're really learning the material. The final example is, of course, more interesting for us as sort of political science people, as voters want politicians to implement certain types of policies and not sell out after the election, or they want them to be, not corrupt, to be proper and honest, rather than accept bribes from all sorts of other people. The other problem that plagues the principal-agent relationship is the problem of adverse selection. And like moral hazard, this term sort of comes from the insurance industry, so it's slightly weird sounding, I think. And adverse selection basically characterizes a process whereby, the type of contract that you're offering, you adversely select bad types in some form. The most extreme example of this is Akerlof's market for lemons, which some of you maybe have heard about. The basic idea of the market for lemons idea is that lemons are bad used cars in American sort of terminology, right? So what's the market for lemons? Well, this is sort of the most extreme example of adverse selection, basically. So if you have sellers of used cars, and potential buyers of used cars, the sellers of used cars have some sort of idea of whether their car is a good car, a peach, or a bad car, a lemon, right? But of course, the buyers don't know what kind of quality the car is. But the seller, who has a lemon, who has a crappy used car, would of course be willing to sell this car for some price. And the buyer might be willing to pay this price if, on average, he has some sort of chance of getting a peach or a lemon, good car or bad car. But of course, on the side of the if the price that is sort of negotiated between buyers and sellers is sort of an average of good cars and bad cars, then of course the sellers of the good cars don't really have an incentive to sell their cars, because the price is too low, because they have actually a good car, and sort of the price that they can get for their used car is sort of an average of good car and bad car kind of prices in a way. But on the other hand, the sellers of the bad cars, of the lemons, are really keen to sell at the sort of going market rate for a given model, for example, right? So as a consequence, you basically end up with a market where there's lots of willing sellers of lemons, of crappy cars, and not so many people who are happy to sell the good cars, who don't have the technical problems or something. And the buyer doesn't know this, and is of course willing to offer only a very low price for sort of used cars, taking into account that there are lots of bad cars out in the market, and as a consequence, this market basically unravels. So this is a very, very extreme example, of course, and we found mechanisms to stop this from happening. But the key problem for adverse selection is always distinguishing between sort of different types. Let's look at a couple examples here. So we always have a principal who selects, in this example, an agent, and this agent has basically private information, hidden information. So this can be about the quality of the used car that he or she is willing to sell, right? That the buyer cannot observe. But often we can think of this as sort of information about types, about the type of car they have, or about the type of person they are, for example. So we can think of the buyer and seller of used cars in the lemons example, or we can think about a health insurance company. If you think about the sort of the American case, basically before the Affordable Care Act, or in places where this is not really feasible for some reason, we can think about the health insurance. What is the health insurance willing to offer? Well, they want, of course, people who are healthy, and who don't have pre-existing conditions, for example, right? But of course, those who have kind of health problems or anticipate them are more likely to want to buy health insurance, and this kind of creates this problem. And the term adverse selection comes from the insurance kind of context. We can extend this to other cases. We can think about employers and employees, of course. So an employer wants sort of smart, hardworking employees, of course. But this is really, really difficult to know in ex ante who these sort of good employees are, of course. The job applicants all look sort of the same. So you want someone who's smart and works well. And that's why basically there's a mechanism of letters of recommendation and people taking courses at universities that are hard, where they can show that they are the hardworking and the clever type, right? And of course, we can also apply this kind of logic to our standing relationship between voters and politicians, right? So in the moral hazard case, it was all about sort of how do we keep the politician once in office from doing something that is in their own self-interest, sort of changing their behavior. If we think about the principal agent problem from a adverse selection point of view, basically we can think more about sort of competence, about different types of politicians. I think intuitively we all sense that there are some people who are better at this than others. Some people are more efficient managers of the sort of national affairs than others. But of course, it's really, really hard for the voter to know in advance, who are the good ones and who are the bad ones, and who are the competent, efficient managers, who are the non-corrupt types, for example, also, and who are the sort of corrupt or incompetent or lazy types. And that's kind of the principal agent problem in the adverse selection case in a nutshell. So there's always an information asymmetry. One of the players knows something that the other player doesn't know. We talked about market for lemons. There's always different types, and there are different ways to basically think about how this problem gets solved. And these are often signaling or screening models. So in the signaling model, we can think about education, the education example in the employee case, for example. Students get an education at the university and take difficult classes because they want to be able to signal to potential employers or to the master's programs or whatever it is that they are both smart and sort of hardworking. So basically allowing people to signal that they are the good types. And politicians, for example, could engage in some costly signaling that shows that they are competent politicians or honest politicians. For example, by opening their finances or something like this. The other sort of types of devices that we can use to distinguish between the good and the bad types are basically screening models where people sort of self-select into different types of contracts, and that's much harder in the political kind of sphere case. Arguably, we could even think of that sort of being a bad example, because we might have people who specifically select into politics because they really want the power, because they want the ability to shuffle sort of money to their friends or something. So we might actually be in a situation where adverse selection is a really big problem in politics. So how do we solve this thorny issue of principal agent problems, the moral hazard and adverse selection problem vis-a-vis politicians? In economics in general, when you talk about information asymmetry, there are lots of solutions. There's a whole field, contract theory, that is basically about sort of making people do what you want. This can be employees or sort of contractors, etc. Or we can think about the bureaucracy, or we can think about the government vis-a-vis economic actors. And there are lots of tools and lots of possibilities. The problem, of course, is that some or many of these tools, these solutions, are not really available in the political arena. So the most commonly used things in the private sector are things like performance pay or sort of key performance indicators. People have to do certain things in order to get paid at all, to be fired, and those are usually written down or specified in quite concrete terms, sort of what they have to do, and often pay is sort of aligned with performance in terms of bonuses or in terms of it being directly related to sales, for example, or something like this. Both of these solutions are, of course, not possible for politics. Being prime minister doesn't come with sort of key performance indicators that are then used to evaluate the person on fire if necessary, or sort of dock their pay or give them a bonus if they did especially well. None of these are available because the types of tasks that we want, for example, prime minister or president to complete, are really, really complicated and cannot be pre-specified. It's more complicated than hiring someone to sell as many cars as possible, right? So it's really, really hard to do this, and we also can only renew their contracts every few years. So there's no constant evaluation of performance really possible. But sometimes opinion polls kind of serve this role, of course. So politicians are notoriously in tune to how they're doing in terms of popularity, or things like by-elections or second-order elections, like state elections, are sometimes used for these kind of things. The only tool that we have, in a way, as voters, vis-a-vis the politicians who are our agents, the only accountability mechanism that we have is the contingent renewal kind of mechanism. So we might want to or should only re-elect those leaders or those parties, if you think about sort of beyond specific leaders, if their performance is good. And this is the idea of retrospective voting. So we can basically use some sort of running tally, in the words of Fiorina, a summary judgment of their overall performance, evaluated, depending on our own sort of interests, to evaluate the performance of these leaders. For example, in part, this being sort of the economic performance of the country as a whole, and then judge them based on that. And if they don't perform well, you don't re-elect them, even if they are sort of your most preferred party, perhaps. And if they do well, you can sort of vote for them again. And if a sufficiently large chunk of the electorate engages in this kind of retrospective voting, in this kind of like performance-based voting, then we can maybe have some sort of accountability mechanism where we can make politicians do things that we want them to do.